Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for Mom Guilt and Good Enough Pandemic Parenting. My name is Victoria Bruick, and I am the digital content producer for Pandemic Parenting. I want to introduce our first two panelists. Dr. Amanda Zelechoski is a clinical and forensic psychologist and an associate professor of psychology at Valparaiso University. Dr. Lindsay Malloy is a developmental and forensic psychologist and an associate professor at Ontario Tech University. You can read more about them and their backgrounds on our website. With that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. So whenever we do these webinars, we have someone serve as a moderator. And one of our goals and reasons for doing that is to really try to kind of introduce and amplify emerging scholars in the field. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Agata Freedle, who is an assistant professor in the clinical mental health program at Lindenwood University and a licensed professional counselor. So her research areas include trauma, grief, and loss. Specifically, she explores factors that can foster resilience and positive psychological change following adverse experiences. So thanks for being here, Agata, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just so excited to be here for the discussion with our panelists as well as the guest speaker, which will be followed by the Q&A. So like Victoria mentioned, this is your chance to ask any questions you might have about the topic, mom guilt, and put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can toward the end of our webinar tonight. So I would love to introduce now our guest speaker, Dr. Sharon Lamb. She's a professor in counseling psychology at UMass Boston. She wrote numerous books on sexual education, child development, and psychology. And her most recent book, The Not Good Enough Mother, she will be able to share a little bit about that with us tonight. So let's start. Let's just jump right in and let's start with this idea of mom guilt. What is that? Where's the term coming from? And maybe Lindsay, you can start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it actually would be helpful to even break it down further. So not just the more narrow concept of mom guilt, but think about what we mean by guilt in general. And I lecture about guilt in my intro to developmental psych class, while I lecture about emotional development in kids. And so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the timing of when we develop guilt and how interesting it is that guilt is not one of these emotions that we have, when we're born. So there are lots of emotions that even newborns express. They show us distress, anger, fear, happiness. And then sometime between the ages of about 18 to 24 months, they develop what we call the self-conscious emotions. So guilt, pride, shame. And these emotions depend on their ability to recognize and think about themselves in relation to other people. So if they're going to feel pride about something, they have to be able to sort of be thinking about, what they're doing and how it relates to the standards that other people have for their behavior. And they can't really do this before about 18 months old, but then they can reliably do it by about age 3. And then by the time we're 40, we get really, really good at having these self-conscious emotions, especially guilt. So I just think it's maybe appropriate to keep that in the back of our minds, that guilt is this self-conscious emotion that to experience it, we're reflecting on what other people think about us, or reflecting on the standards that other people are holding for us, or that we're holding for ourselves. And then we're feeling bad or regretful or remorseful when we don't live up to those. So something I've been thinking about.
It just makes me think about also too the importance of distinguishing between guilt and shame, because I think we mix those up a lot. And so guilt is feeling bad after making a mistake or a poor choice, and it can motivate us to work towards some change. But shame, on the other hand, causes us to label ourselves or as being bad or, as a failure. And that kind of feeling can really prevent us from making positive change. So with guilt, we might say something like, I screwed up, right? How can I do better next time? But with shame, we might say, I screwed up. I'm a terrible mother. So interestingly, mom guilt isn't actually guilt. It's really shame. And like Lindsay was talking about with children developing the capacity for guilt, the capacity for guilt is an important part of our growth as a parent as well, because it sort of allows us to take a step back and, think about our parenting, reevaluate what we've done, and just get better at it. But when we feel shame, we can get stuck in this cycle of comparing ourselves to other people, right? And that can kind of get in the way of our ability to adapt or improve. So I just think that's an important distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely. Like, I feel like sometimes that shame can really make us feel stuck in that place. What about you, Sharon? What do you think about that concept of mom guilt? And do you feel like it changed in the past compared to the past?
Well, I was just thinking about that sort of idea of shame, which was a new one for me. And I think you're absolutely right that it is more of a feeling of shame that we have when we don't live up to what we think are our own expectations, but really, as you say, it's a self-conscious emotion. So we're always picturing what society expects of us. And when we start looking at what society expects of us as mothers, we have to look at, the huge burden that's placed on mothers with regard to how their children turn out, or in terms of just taking care of their children too, but really in terms of judging, how a child turns out and their well-being. And that's not that's not guilt-prone kind of thinking. It really is shame-prone thinking, because it's about this huge monolithic idea of society pointing its finger at you and saying you're bad, your child messed up at school, you're bad. So
gosh, I feel that, Sharon, from the moment I became a mother. It's like I birthed the guilt as well. It feels like the pressure is on with every decision we make, right? Even with childbirth, what type of birth plan? Are you going to get an epidural or not? Are you going to breastfeed? Are you going to bottle feed? Co-sleeping? Are you a working mom? Are you stay-at-home mom? Like, it goes on and on, these decisions we have to make. And I've even talked about this with my mom. And at times she said, like, she feels so bad for my generation of moms because we're saturated with all that information you were talking about. And so sometimes she'll tell me, like, oh, it feels like it was easier to raise kids when there weren't so many options and social media wasn't a factor and you weren't like inundated with all this information. And part of that makes me think, like, Lindsay, we talked about in our first pandemic parenting exchange about the research on cognitive load and how moms tend to bear like more of this worry and decision making. So I'm sure that that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the feeling that you're going to be judged is going to make you hyper about what you choose to, and have to defend it in a hyper way instead of sort of being, if you were in a community of mothers that were all supporting each other, there'd be some more welcoming of all different kinds of strokes and different kinds of ways of mothering. But instead it's, this burden on the individual mother who has this intensive relationship with a child or two or three children, and the rest of the world is looking on, and they better perform the perfect mother for those onlookers.
Yeah, so it's almost
go for it. No, so I was just going to jump in because I was reading a study as I was prepping for this that talked about, like, the more mothers feared negative evaluation of others, the more guilt and shame they felt about their mothering. So what you just said just made me think about that, like that imaginary audience that we think is evaluating every little or big decision that we're making. So,
and we do that to other mothers too. It's not, I mean, we create that imaginary audience because we are judging other mothers all the time. There aren't enough spaces where you can get together and sort of share the burden and, share the whatever shame, especially the shame of pandemic parenting these days, right?
Yeah. Yes, it almost sounds like it's this part of being a mom in America is kind of part of this being so socialized into this role. And it's kind of general. So what about during this pandemic? What moms have to be guilty about, especially now during this time?
Everything.
Oh my gosh! I mean, if you think about the unspoken goal of perfect parenting is just to be there constantly for every whim or a direction or education your child needs. you don't get a break from that then, because they're there 24/7. I think for most of us, most of the kids aren't going to actual school now, but mostly online. So, I mean, how can you even get that break at all?
Yeah, mine just started school here in Canada, so I've had a few days, but yeah, it's just relentless, really. This is like relentless parenting. But I mean, I've been thinking about just like prepping for this webinar. I had a lot of deadlines this week, so I was doing a lot of work over the weekend, which of course I felt guilty about. Then at one point on Sunday morning, I'm up here listening to my kids play, and I'm prepping this webinar on mom guilt, and I'm feeling guilty about how I can hear them play. I'm like, this is a new level, you know, like this is a very meta thing, mom guilt, about prepping a webinar on mom guilt. But I've been feeling guilty about things that aren't even logical, like talking to my husband and saying things like, oh, you know, it's the end of the summer. I can't believe we didn't go on enough bike rides. We didn't do enough of this. We didn't do enough of that. And he's like, he doesn't feel any, he's like, what's wrong with you? Like, we're in a pandemic, you know, why are you lamenting having not gone on enough bike rides? And it's, you know, when you put it like that, it does make a lot of sense. I'm like, that's not very logical for me to be worried about and feeling bad about, but it hasn't necessarily stopped me from doing that.
You know, Lindsay, what strikes me about that, and it sounds like what how a lot of mothers put it to themselves too, is that it's almost disconnected from your desire to go on bike rides with your kids, which it sounds like deep down there would be a desire, like, I wish I could have gone on more, but it gets transformed into, am I a good enough mother because my children need to have bike rides and they need to be outside? And it seems to me that that's a way out of that trap too, to think, what do I really love doing with my kids, and how can I make more of that space for that in my life?
Which is such a good reminder, Sharon, separating out the what I want to do versus the what I should do. Like, I was just thinking as you were talking about bike riding, my kids always want to go on bike rides, and I'm like, okay, I guess I should really want to do this. And so how much of that decision making sometimes is driven by the shoulds versus the like, no, what do I enjoy really doing with them versus what does a good mother do, like you said, or what should I want to do?
Yeah.
I do admire those parents who know exactly what they love and they want their child to participate in something they love too. As a, you know, training psychologist, I'm sure as a counselor, you two way back then I was very child focused, like, what do you want? You create the time and I'm going to follow you like I'm Mr. Rogers or Carl Rogers all the time. But I now admire more the parent who's saying, I really love to bake, so you're going to bake with me today because that's my goal for my psychological health. Or if you don't want to, go play puppets by yourself.
Yeah.
But, you know, but I was feeling so guilty about it over the summer. So I have not been, I haven't started my job till August, but my daughter's daycare reopened in June. So I felt so guilty about sending her back to daycare when in reality, I could have stayed home with her for a couple months longer, but like for my own mental health, I felt it was so important to have a little bit of that space before I started my job. So definitely could relate to that. Yeah.
And we know that daycare is good for kids. I mean, where is this guilt coming from daycare? You know the research, right? You teach human development. But I mean, if it's a good daycare, it's good for the child.
It is, but there's so much pressure from other parents, that shaming, like, why would you send during the pandemic, your child back to school? So
because children need other people. They need other grown-ups. I think that's something that we always forget, how rich, and I mean, maybe you have your parents visiting with your children through the pandemic, but what a rich life a child has when they have many adults who care about them in their life, and many people they can turn to and learn from, including daycare providers.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I've felt that, Agata, myself, with the pressure, the kind of, it doesn't even matter what, like, you're sending them back at that age, or, my favorite, like, I could never let a stranger raise my child. Okay. It's just like all of these, I know, but it's just one of those issues that I think there's a lot of shaming about the various daycare arrangements and situations, and even knowing the research on daycare and teaching about it, you still have those glimmers of like, am I doing the right thing? And
But don't you think the person who's shaming you feels ashamed too in some way? That's the weird thing about it. They're not going home and saying, I'm doing a perfect job because my child's on daycare. They're just ashamed about something else. I mean, it's just a way to divide women and mothers from one another instead of joining together to, work for, better resources, more community, free daycare, for example.
Sharon, so do you feel like your experience or perspective on mom guilt has changed over time?
I think I've learned a lot and I can intellectually understand it, but have I overcome it? But, no, I don't think so. I think it's just a running conversation in my head, and maybe that's true for anyone who's trying to overcome some, problematic thinking, is that you have to sort of counteract it again and again when you start to feel guilty about this or that. I mean, I try to spend some time every day with my grandson who's in Texas, and he just wants to play the same game over and over, and I know he really needs to play that game over and over, and I'm getting a little bored with that game. And so there's that running conversation in my head. Is it okay for me to say, no, I want to play this today? And then I rationalize it saying, well, it's good because if he had other children to play with, his older sibling has severe autism. And so he can't really play those games. So I played all the imagination games with him. But, it's sure kids have to learn to adjust to other people. And that's the running commentary for me. And I think it's part of that mother guilt too. It's like, do you count as a person? And is it okay for your children to understand that you count as a person and they have to pay attention to your needs? I mean, their needs come first, of course, and a good mother's a selfless mother, but not like that book, The Giving Tree, where the tree keeps nothing. Right.
Yeah. And people romanticize that book, and they romanticize the mother as a martyr concept. I feel like a lot, and even just I'm trying to remember the exact words that you just said there because they were so profound. When you're like, you count as a person too, and it's just, oh yeah, I do count as a person, and it is important for my children to understand that. Like, not just for me, but for them. It's important for them to understand that and to have empathy. And
so it's almost like teaching your children boundaries by showing them how you can set your own boundaries and respect that. Right?
Oh, that too. That's another element to it too. And I totally agree with that. But I think it's not just boundaries. It's about, you're a person with feelings and and interests too, and every wish you have for them isn't just for their own good. Some of it's for your own good too, and they might be disappointed that their needs aren't in the forefront every moment of your day. But isn't that a good lesson too, to learn how to cope with disappointment and to be patient for when you can be center stage again?
Right.
Yeah, I think that we exist. And we exist as separate people from them, which is right at the time that they're developing and understand how they're separate people, and understanding themselves in relation to others. So I like that a lot.
Well, that's really an interesting concept because that's where that whole concept of good enough mothering comes from. It comes from D.W. Winnicott, who wrote a lot about children and play, and he talks about transitional objects, like the teddy bears that kids, and play time as being this liminal space, which is kind of connected to the mother or the mother's being and separate, and that the play and the transitional object is something that combines their understanding of I'm a separate being and I'm connected to her. And I think that that's what good enough mothering does. I think it says, you're a separate being. You're okay without me. You can go on being when I'm not hovering over you. And you are a part of me and a part of my life. And I want that to be so. And the kinds of pressure society's putting on mother is all on that. You're a part of me and you're first and foremost, and I'm your whole world. And I don't think that's good mothering as opposed to good enough mothering. I think good enough mothering is good mothering because it gives the child that freedom to understand you as a separate person and to know that they'll be okay for periods of time without you.
Yeah, I definitely want to explore that concept of good enough mother more. But before we do that, can we go back for a second? Because we mentioned that a little bit earlier. So I want to go back to that. Why are we talking about mom guilt versus like father guilt or parent guilt, or why is it specifically mother guilt?
Yeah, we thought we might get some flack for that. So where that comes from is, I mean, there really is a lot of research evidence from many fields, psychology, sociology, anthropology, that even though we've had progression in society and society has evolved over the last few decades, especially in terms of parenting, like mothers working outside the home, moms tend to still be viewed, for better or worse, as the primary caregivers of children. And so the research is pretty clear that they're still bearing a lot of the child rearing activities, even when they work full time. And so because of that, and I think for a lot of the reasons Sharon was saying, like we're more likely to feel judged than fathers, including when it comes to our kids' behavior, their performance and outcomes, that moms tend to be more judged on that. So if you think about these things like the mommy wars and mommy shaming, that we've been talking about, there's not really the daddy equivalent that we have seen in the research. So it's not to say that there aren't a lot of dads who are primary caregivers, there are, or that fathers who don't experience dad guilt, but it just seems to be less prevalent for dads than we see for moms. And there was even a New York Times article a couple days ago, as Sharon was saying, like we're seeing this even more in the pandemic. And it was just talking about how much worse the mommy shaming has gotten throughout the pandemic, that it's at an all-time high. And so I think, as Lindsay was starting to talk about too with daycare, like this is especially the case with working moms in the research sort of around the mommy shaming and difficulty around how working moms are balancing things, but that they still bear the brunt of that like cognitive load.
Yeah, I guess the thing that went unspoken here is, what's up with dads? Right? I mean, why are we celebrating when a dad does something? It's their responsibility too. I think that it's a different era, and many dads are full parenting with moms today, but it's certainly not equal yet. And there's a switch that happens in couples with the first child. A friend of mine, Molly Millwood, wrote a book, To Have and to Hold, which is all about the transformation in a couple's relationship when the first child is born. And it's striking. The research shows that couples that were totally equal in everything, all of a sudden gender diversify, and not only taking care of the baby, but the dishes and all the other stuff becomes the woman's responsibility. What happens that turns everybody into, their parents again at that point?
Yeah.
And, I don't want to blame men for taking advantage of that situation too, because I'm sure they have a lot of gender expectations about being breadwinners. And I know that there's a bit of a interaction when a baby's born, when a mother sometimes will push a father away because they want that intensive experience, because that's what society expects, that sort of big, bubble where the world goes away and it's just you and your baby, that lovely time, which does shut out. We're pretty heterosexist here, imagining male, female marriage. I just want to note that, but that's, and the research does show that when there are two lesbian moms, you're not having that same level of mother guilt and inequality in the household too. The chores are shared much more. So back to the heterosexual couple, the father does get pushed out a little bit, and and becomes more of a playmate unless he fights to be within that circle too.
So interesting. Yeah.
The kind of, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to talk more about the kind of societal expectations that are heaped on mothers versus fathers, and you know, the kinds of things that you're just supposed to do. So like as a mom, you can put on the most amazing children's birthday party with, like, you know, themed everything, handmade, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, yeah, that's what you do. Like, you're a mom. And then, you know, I used to talk to my colleague about when her husband would take her kids to the park. It was like, oh, like, you know, like a hero. And I had another friend who was a stay-at-home dad when his daughter was little, you know, a baby, and people would come up and like, thank you so much for your service to our country. Like, he used to joke that, you know, I mean, they didn't really say that, but that was the kind of reception that he got, just doing, you know, the most basic things. So I do think that, you know, being kind of socialized into these different roles, and also with these different expectations and kind of people pleasing kind of more roles for women and girls, that, you know, these issues of guilt and shame are more likely to come up. And I mean, that's definitely what the research shows. I mean, I was looking at some, preparing for this, like, you know, moms more likely to have been criticized for their parenting, more likely to internalize the criticism, and, you know, report feeling more unsure about their parenting choices after. There's just a lot, like, on moms' plates they're trying to balance.
Well, and that part of expectations too, sorry, it was just making me think back to the, you know, when we were sort of comparing maybe expectations on dads versus moms. You know, this is especially the case when it comes to sort of working moms, and the research around like how much more time women spend apologizing for their appearance, their surroundings, the fact that they're trying to multitask, especially right now in the pandemic. I was having this conversation with my husband recently about why more women, we've both noticed in our work context, seem to turn off their cameras during Zoom meetings than men. And I was explaining, you know, I think this is because women are just judged differently, right? If their house is in shambles behind them and there's kids' toys everywhere and they're appearing differently and maybe not as, you know, put together, they're going to be judged differently perhaps than their male counterparts. And so for a lot of women, it's just like, you know, no, I'm here to focus, and I don't want to need to apologize for my surroundings in having to, you know, be in a pandemic and have my kids around me while I'm trying to multitask. So it's not that we don't recognize, I think, what we're all saying here, that dads can't feel guilt also, parent guilt, but just that the research seems to indicate a much higher prevalence of this phenomenon for women because of a lot of these societal sort of expectations.
Well, I'm wondering too, and maybe somebody will do a study of this, is whether it undermines a woman's authority in the workplace when colleagues are seeing the kids running around.
Right.
In the background. For me, I just adore seeing a kid run across in a meeting, but I'm not sure that's the same case for other people. And you're thinking, I mean, we're in academia, but if you're in like a company that's kind of high powered and you want to be rising in the ranks, I mean, you probably want to control your image in a way that Zoom and the pandemic isn't letting you right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Or even just like people assuming, well, she's distracted, or we shouldn't give her this new project or this new task because she's obviously got a lot on her plate, or she's, you know, distracted or has these other commitments. So yeah, I think as academics, we're lucky in that way that we don't have some of those same standards, let's say.
It depends probably too where you're an academic.
That's
right?
true. That's true. What field? Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder with this idea of perception versus reality, is there really a merit to that? Should we be feeling guilty? And like, what's the good parent? So kind of going back to your book, Sharon, can you tell us more about this? What makes a good enough parent?
Well, just to frame the book a little bit, I do some forensic evaluations of mostly mothers, sometimes fathers, who are about to lose custody, parental rights permanently of their children. They've been given many, many chances, and somehow I'm called upon to support the final decision, or not support, or say, give this parent one more chance. Those are I do a lot of other forensic evaluations, but those are the ones I write about in the book. And And if you want to feel like a good enough mother, you should read some of the histories of these. The kinds of things, to lose a child, the kinds of things you do are pretty severe. It's not just violence against a child, because of course you can always go to parenting classes and get therapy but it's the time and time again of neglecting their needs, and a mindset of always putting your needs first. And of course, addiction plays a big part in that, in terms of putting, when you have an addiction, it's almost hard to, put anybody's needs ahead of your own addiction. So many of these parents who lose their children have been addicted for many years and haven't been able to follow through on the suggestions that their DCF workers or child service workers have given them. But when I do my evaluations and I watch a mother with a child, like in a meeting, because they usually don't have a child in their custody, so they meet in a DCF office or a church basement. And when I'm watching to see what kind of attachment is there and how they respond to their child's attachment, things that get me every time are when parents deny their child's needs or mock their children for having needs. And in some ways, I can see now I'm making everybody feel guilty, because your kids are all needy right now and they're bugging you all the time. And you say, stop it. But it's a different kind of thing. I mean, I think a good enough mother says, I know that you want me to do this now, and you have a right to want me to do this now, but I can't do it right now, kind of thing. And I think the parenting that's really problematic is when you don't validate that a child can have needs, that they can have a self. And that's different than putting yourself first and saying, now it's time for you to pay attention to what I want to do or what I need. It's about saying your needs don't count at all. And that's what I think I saw in the parents that ended up losing their children. The ones who, if a child like cuts herself on a toy and goes, I have a boo-boo, will you kiss it? And the mother mocks them for saying, oh, it's such a stupid, you need a kiss for that. It's that kind of rejecting. Now, a pandemic parent who's like on 3 phone calls and Zoom and doing something, and a child wants to, who's distracted and says, go ask your dad. That's different than mocking the child for wanting a finger kissed. And the child who just constantly wants their boo-boo kissed, 40 times that day, of course you're going to blow up sometime and not be the best. But it's those little things that a parent misses as a bid for attachment, instead of just I'm bored and whiny and don't feel good, but a bid for attachment, and just missing those, not once or twice, but constantly missing those and rejecting the child when they just need to be, attached for a little bit. That's, I think, what's not good enough.
I so appreciate that distinction, Sharon, because a couple years or shortly after my second child was born, I was doing research in this area and came across this term, good enough parenting. And, with a relatively newborn at that time, I remember thinking this is terrible. What a terrible way to frame it. Nobody gives birth and looks at that baby wrapped in their arms and says, you know what? I'm going to be satisfactory. I'm just going to try to be good enough and mediocre for you. Because you can't tell a woman who's been, maybe fighting her whole life to be great or to work hard to just, be mediocre, be good enough for this big test she's going to face of motherhood. So I just really appreciate that distinction, because I remember feeling I don't think any of us strives to be a good enough parent. We want to be a great parent. I want to be the perfect parent for this perfect little baby that was just handed to me. But it helps me sort of wrap my head around this idea that there's no such thing as a perfect parent, I think is what you're saying, but more we just need to sort of be the right fit at that time. And it may be that, you're saying, that means more attention to what you need for a period of time to be able to meet your child's needs. But it doesn't mean you have to be this perfect parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a lot of kids in foster care, and I've seen very uneducated parents who probably haven't read all the magazines that you or I have read do some beautiful moments just fostering a child which is just, you know, in the daily ins and outs of things, stopping for a moment and listening. You don't have to be perfect and great all the time. Just having those moments really builds a child, gives them that sort of inner I count, you know, my opinions count, my needs count, so that when you're busy and you have no time for them, they can withstand that period. And I think we misinterpret what it is to be a great mother, which is to constantly have the right response and be good, you know, and all, you know, saying the right thing to them. And I think that you just build up those moments so that they can tolerate when you're not so great. And that's great that they can tolerate people not so great. Isn't it great if a child can tolerate somebody not, you know, at their beck and call? I mean, think about for a son, what a great husband he's going to be someday.
Yeah. No, it makes me think about like the attachment research and the you know, idea of like a pattern of caregiving, that you want to have a consistent, sensitive pattern of caregiving, but it doesn't mean you're going to get it right every single time, right? Like that.
Well, I worry about you saying getting it right too, because I think like that you would then interpret the mom who says, go away, I can't deal with you right now, I'm doing something, is not getting it right. But I want to say that that moment is getting it right too, because the child needs the real mother, you know, all the time.
No, that's totally, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I think just having the, you know, the...
Don't apologize, Lindsay. We're not doing any more apologizing.
Not responding how you would ideally maybe like to respond every single time. I think when my first was born 5 years ago, I was very much like, one wrong move and I'm going to quote unquote ruin this, you know, this baby. Like, and I think that, you know, that's probably because of the way partly at least the parenting industry kind of sets up all the how-to books, and this is exactly what you have to do, and, you know, get it wrong one time.
You know, but you bring up another point too, and that's that we are judged by how our kids turn out. And that's a lot of what my book is about too, because when I wrote it, my older son was having a lot of trouble, and I kept thinking, gosh, my son is in so much trouble now. How am I, you know, how can I judge other mothers when I must have done such a bad job for my son to have? And, you know, of course, if everything doesn't turn out right, you look to yourself and say, what could I have done differently? On the other hand, there's so much that goes into predicting or shaping what, I mean, your children are young now, but just wait till they're in junior high and then high school. There's so much that goes into shaping who a person is. And some of that is temperament and biological. Some of that is peers. Some of that is societal. But because we believe in intensive mothering, we think we can protect our children from all of that and make sure that they turn out perfectly in spite of all those horrible things that are out there in the world. And we do the best we can, and sometimes we can't do that. And so that's what I was trying to do in my book, go back and forth between my own mother guilt and how I was judging other mothers. And, you know, did I have a right to judge other mothers? Only because I was trying to protect children in the future. On the other hand, I also needed to see them with as much empathy as I needed to give myself, which I hope I ended up showing by the end of the book. That's why you write books too, anyway, to try to work out those kinds of intense issues, I think.
Yeah, just so appreciated. Yeah, those parallels you drew with your own experience.
Absolutely.
Turning to you, Lindsay, now. So do you think the concept of parenting, do you think that changed over time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in doing, you know, some reading about it, I think what's interesting to me is that the shift from parent as a noun to parenting as a verb, and that this entire kind of word or concept of parenting as something that you do rather than a parent being something that you are, didn't sort of emerge until the 1970s. So I think Victoria has an article that I was looking at that was in the Wall Street Journal from a developmental psychologist, and I think that just feeds into and reinforces the idea of mom guilt. like when it's something that you do, that you have to be good at, that you have to get good at. You know, we've been taught, you know, you want to do this type of job, you study hard, you go to these classes, you get this kind of degree, you get all the right ingredients, and then you will be successful at it. And a lot of people have, for many different reasons, kind of taking that approach to parenting. Like, we're going to produce this child, and so we need to do this, this, and this. And then if we do all of these things exactly, you know, right, then we're going to create the child that we want. And you know, or a child that's going to be successful and is going to have a good life. And I think if we think about it more as trying to, you know, think about their needs and meeting their needs, helping them become the person that they want to be rather than the person that we have in mind for them, then there's sort of not as much of a right thing to do. Right?
I love that. I want to add to that something about vulnerability of people too, because we talk about parents and kids as if they're these perfect beings that, you know, everything's going right and that they don't have any vulnerabilities. We, you know, and you know, somebody can have developmental disabilities, children can have. Somebody can have, you know, they can be in grief over the loss of a parent during their parenting. And we're not taking any of that into consideration when we're thinking about how things work out. We think of then those other things instead of being uniqueness about the individuals. We think about them as problems or obstacles to work around because the images of the perfect parent, the perfect child. And I mean, I think that the more people can talk about those vulnerabilities with each other, the better support we can give other parents about those. And that goes from when our kids have trouble and that they're vulnerable, and when we have trouble and we're vulnerable, whether it's the depressed parenting, or my daughter-in-law does a blog on raising an autistic child, the Autism Cafe, if you want to put that in there, and constantly being attacked for what she's doing wrong by just even talking about an autistic child. You know, putting your mothering out there today means, and putting your vulnerability out there, or putting your child's vulnerability out there means that you're sort of putting yourself up for grabs in terms of critique. But I've been thinking a lot about that lately, about how we pretend to not have vulnerabilities, and we look to model ourselves over to be people without vulnerability, and that's just crazy. Oops, I'm not allowed to use that word. I'm a psychologist.
So I wonder, how do we shift from this mindset of being a perfect parent to being good enough parent, and how does it look like during pandemic? Being good enough parent.
I mean, I love that that people tell their bad parenting stories and share them. They don't have to call them bad parenting, really.
Honest. They're honest.
Yeah.
I think you have to be making. I think that you have to create a culture in calling out people who are judging other people too about that too, as well as bringing people in. I think there's a calling in and a calling out that you do with anything that's sort of making it harder for somebody else. And one of the ways to call in or to respond differently is to offer help. Even when you're up to the, gills with the work for you to say, okay, that's a parent who needs some help right now. How can we all be helping? That concept of other mothers, I wrote about in my book about the African-American community that arose from the times of slavery, when you had to rely on other mothers to take care of your child for you. And that was really adaptive, and it was really strengthening for the children and for a parent to know that they have other mothers to rely on. If you can find your own other mothers group, if you can offer your other mother ability to other people's children, if you see a child that's in need and has some, issues, if you can be that kind of mom that says, well, let's bring them into the fold a little too and relieve that mother's burden, at least we can bring down that sort of culture of judging other people.
Yeah, I love that. And just thinking about like at its core, when I think about good enough parenting in the pandemic right now, it's just like remembering, what do kids need, right? At the end of the day, they need to feel safe. They need to feel that they are taken care of, that there are grownups who care about them and are going to be there for them. So it's just thinking about like, am I meeting those basic needs, which are just to keep them, safe, make them feel nurtured and loved.
They need to know you're okay.
Right.
Because they rely on you. So do what you can to make yourself okay. And if they don't feel okay, at least they know, well, at least my parents are doing it. At least there's...
I think that's a great point. Exactly. They do not feel safe when they feel that their parent is not okay. Absolutely. So I think that's a great reminder.
I think you forgot to mention bike rides.
She just said, I need to be okay, Lindsay. Sharon said, I need to be okay.
Lindsay will take your bike rides for you, because I know in her heart of hearts she wants to be out there.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a great conversation so far. I love just hearing all the input about research and personal experiences, but I want to make sure we answer some of the questions. We have been getting some questions for the audience. So I want to make sure we answer those too. The question came up about culture, and one of our attendees is wondering how much of that guilt and shame we feel is rooted in the Western culture, especially American values. So how can we expect us to support each other as we're expected to be also individually exceptional, right? So are there any differences maybe between cultures?
Who is that smarty? Put her in the panel right there. You're sensing that I'm saying that we need to be more collectivist as mothers there. And what do you think about a lesson from this pandemic about being about that? I mean, it's been so hard for our nation to understand that you wear your mask for other people, not for yourself. People still don't get it, that you're not preventing yourself from getting COVID. You're preventing other. It's just a whole mindset that you're thinking of the community right now. Will we make it? I mean, how many months of this will help us make that switch over to a community kind of focus? But you're absolutely right. And your question is more just a comment, like, how are we ever going to do this when we're such an individualistic, achievement-oriented kind of culture?
But I think there might be ways in our like smaller communities, right? Because I agree. I mean, when we look to other cultures and other countries where it really is as you were giving those examples, Sharon, of like the village and the other mothers and people sort of swooping in and doing this collectively. I do think that's where a lot of these expectations come. And like right now we're so isolated, so it feels even more individual. But are there ways for us to kind of lean into our small villages and our communities, whatever that looks like, even if you're having to do so in socially distanced or virtual ways, there are still ways to support each other, or how can we strive to do that? What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I mean, one of the hardest parts about this pandemic is that we've lost our village, but we kind of did that, through various policies and the way families have sort of evolved over the last, like maybe century, at least in North America. Like we have our individual yards and our individual, families, and people tend to live further and further away from their parents and their family members. So in a certain sense, like we've been losing this village for a long time, but this feels very stark and very difficult for a lot of people to just not have people to rely on and for that help and support. So I'm not sure. I mean, I guess we're agreeing.
Well, I've heard of people creating pods.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a lost cause in the pandemic. I think that people will start getting I mean, we're in a transition now, and I think that's an important thing to say to the parents out there. I mean, it's been 6 months of what are we going to do about this? And now people are settling in, and they're transitioning to this could be for the long haul. And I think it's a little bit scary, but I think that it'll be creative too. And this idea of pods might work out, and you might start thinking of pods, not just the family, but of people who can support one another, in the sort of things you need around parenting.
Mm-hmm. So staying with that kind of cultural level, I guess, there's another question. So one of the attendees is interested in the application of the good enough parenting with minority population. How does it differ across populations and socioeconomic groups?
Well, I think that there has been a bit of a focus on, sort of what some imaginary middle class mom, as we've been talking about this. But I just to talk about race, I think Michelle Obama has been a model of the perfect mother too, for better or worse. That might be difficult for, struggling Black mothers to watch her, although she's a fantastic role model in other ways, and she has her mother to support her all the time too. But I think the most important thing that I learned from the work about Black mothers was that carrying forward that basically it takes a village, but that trust in other mothers to rely on doing the parenting. And then, of course, there's some cultures where their extended families live together, which is a whole other kind of relief for mothers, too. We live in a culture, I am a mother-in-law, but we live in a Western culture that sort of vilifies the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship, or the grandparents being sort of on the outside for little visits. But, I'm hoping to go to Texas and be very useful at a time, and very far away in Vermont right now, but I hope there to be very useful, and perhaps that nuclear family thing will change as people rely on extended family and know how much extended family can help. Actually, people are losing their housing and moving in with their parents now, for better or worse, and maybe for the kids sometimes for better.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to say just one thing on that, Agata, because it's such an important question. And I'm so glad, I think it's Natasha who asked, I'm so glad she did, because I think good enough still applies. It's just that good enough looks different, right? Depending on your circumstances. So the core tenets of like keeping your kids safe, physical safety, community safety, like all of those things are still at the crux of what we need to be doing for kids, but it looks different. It looks very different if I'm an African-American mother right now in the midst of what we've been dealing with all summer, and what it means to keep my child safe and to teach my child about safety looks very different than it does for my platinum blonde, young sons right now. So I just think the concept still applies, but we have to have grace and understanding around what good enough means and how people are judged according to different metrics, which just doesn't make sense across, some of these, without factoring in some of these contextual pieces. So I just think it's such an important question and something for us to keep paying attention to. So thank you for asking it, Natasha.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sharon, you mentioned grandparents, and we actually got a lot of questions from grandparents about their guilt and longing to see their grandchildren. I know for my parents, they live in Poland. They absolutely cannot come to the country right now. There are no flights that are flying to the United States. So can we talk about grandparents' guilt, and how does that...
Are you telling us we're still going to feel guilty when we're grandparents?
No, I don't think. I think that there's longing more than guilt. I'm sure your parents in Poland are just longing to be of more help to you. And finally, when you stopped wanting to be that independent daughter doing your own thing, and you really need their help, now they're not allowed to come and help you. So
yeah. Okay. So I think that's all the time we have for the questions. I have one final question that I want to pose to Sharon. Just what advice or message would you give to all the parents out here listening about their parenting, especially right now during this pandemic?
So we've had this lovely conversation that supports a mother, and then I'm going to give them some advice and they're going to go away and feel guilty. I don't think so. Take no advice. advice. Yeah, I guess that it's okay if you count two in the mix of these things. That's not advice. Just remember, it's okay that you count two. And your children need you to be to feel okay during a crisis. And that's what, if you look at kids who do the best in refugee camps, who are in refugee camps for like 3 years, they know their parents are okay and safe. Then they can play and then they can deal with everything. So just take care of yourselves.
I love that.
Thank you. Sometimes you just need that permission, really. And I feel like a lot of parents listening will appreciate that permission to remember and keep in mind that, you know, they have to put their mask on first, and I mean oxygen mask as opposed to, you know, but that it just really is so important to
They'll take
remember.
their clue from you about how to survive in a pandemic. That's your goal. That's your goal right now, is that, you know, this is a crisis, and they're learning the most important, you know, thing, like what counts in a crisis. And, you know, everyone counts. Everyone you love, including yourself.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you for having
all right.
me.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much to Dr. Sharon Lamb for joining us tonight. Please take the time to learn more about her work at SharonLamb.com. Pick up her book, The Not Good Enough Mother. We all highly recommend it. It is excellent. So thank you again for joining us, and just for your calming reassurance that we all just need to keep on keeping on. So it's wonderful to have you.
Oh, thank you. I love talking to you all.
And thank you to Agata Freedle for being our moderator tonight. We really appreciate you keeping this crew moving along and tackling some hard questions. And thanks also to Victoria and our entire pandemic parenting team. If you learned anything tonight or want to continue to find these resources helpful, please consider making a contribution or having your organization think about sponsoring a webinar. Lindsay and I donate our time to pandemic parenting, but we really need to support this amazing team that supports us. So we deeply appreciate any contributions you might be able to make. Please take the time to also go to our website, and you'll find links to all of our previous webinars and resources. We'll continue to keep putting these out as long as they're helpful and as long as people are benefiting from them. The recording from today's webinar will be up in just a couple days, and we'll post some other resources and reflection questions along with it. You'll also find there our social media accounts that you can follow to get updates and additional resources we've been working on. And all of that to say, we really invite you to join us for our next webinar. We're so excited to announce that we'll be having Dr. Bruce Perry, internationally renowned psychiatrist and child trauma expert, join us on October 1st for our next webinar called Building Resilience, Understanding Patterns of Stress to Design Effective Doses of Meaningful Support. And this is the first place we've announced it, because we want our faithful live joiners to have first dibs at the limited spot for that webinar. So we hope you'll join us on October 1st. Victoria has posted the link to register for that, and we really look forward to seeing you there. And thank you again, everybody. Stop apologizing, take care of yourselves, just like Dr. Lamb has told us, and we will see you next time. Thank you for being here.